All right. All right. Chuck, we have a happy occasion today, and that is to discuss some good theology. So I'm Brock. I'm happy to be with my friend Chuck. And Chuck, this starts a new chapter for us in Herman Bavinck's Reformed Dogmatics, Volume 2, God and Creation. We are going to be in our new chapter, chapter 3, the names of God. And this is from part 2, which is titled The Living, Acting God. And Chuck, there's something special about this chapter. I know you and I joke, probably me more than you, because I do it a little irreverently. I love to say this is my favorite chapter of the Bible, regardless of which chapter we're in, or I love to say this is my favorite theology book. But at the risk of overusing and overdoing it, this is a really great chapter. This is high quality. There's a lot here to be impressed with in terms of understanding in the chapter. And so, Chuck, let me just throw you to the wolves, discussionally speaking, with respect to this idea of God's names. And I want to do it with a little bit of a joke. You've probably heard the joke of the couple who who were talking one day, and they said, well, what is God's name? I don't think anybody knows. And one of the people said, well, I know God's name. And it was, oh, you do? How do you know God's name? Well, we sang it growing up in church. And they said, oh, what do you mean? And they said, well, how could you miss it? Andy walks with me, Andy talks with me. So God's name is Andy. And so, Chuck, when people, this is a surprisingly unintuitive situation to be in when we're talking about God's names. So a lot of us are thinking, well, wait a minute, is it Ralph? Is it Andy? Is it George? And the jump from there to what the Bible gives us is a journey. And so that's the journey that we hope to unpack in this discussion session. So throwing you over into the midst of following up that joke, what comes into your mind, Chuck? Did you have an Andy moment when you were studying God about his names?
Yeah, I don't know that I ever had an Andy moment. I do remember as a kid, my dad really enjoyed reading out of a version of the Bible called the Jerusalem Bible, and so we would often read out of that version when we weren't reading out of some other more standard version. And in the Jerusalem Bible, the name for God is often Yahweh, right? And so that name, as a young kid, I was exposed to that name, and then it was explained to me, when we would sing out of the hymn book, the old blue Psalter hymnal that we used to sing out of in the churches I grew up in, often used the term Jehovah, and it was explained. I don't know what grade I was in, but in the lower grades in elementary school, one of the teachers said, well, yeah, I mean, Jehovah and Yahweh are the same thing. It's just that people didn't know how to pronounce Yahweh, so they just said Jehovah, and it's just a mispronunciation. I was like, really? And then about the time I graduated from high school, we moved from the old blue 1955 Psalter hymnal to the new 1989 gray or silver Psalter hymnal, and they took all the hymns that had Jehovah in them, like "Guide Me, O Thou Great Jehovah," hymns like that were all changed. They took Jehovah out. "Guide Me, O Thou Great Redeemer" is one of them. But I remember thinking, well, why did they do that? And then it was interesting. Different people had different theories. Some people, the theory was, well, Jehovah is not really God's name, so and Yahweh doesn't quite fit because it's only got two syllables and not three, so it didn't rhyme. So they had to come up with other things. That's some people said. Other people said, oh no, they wanted to take Jehovah out because non-Christians were confused. They thought we were Jehovah's Witnesses because we were using the name Jehovah. Like, that doesn't seem right either. In the end, I don't know that there was, ever an explanation given to me for that. But that is sort of one of the sort of discussions of one of the names of God that I remember sort of from little kid on, having that discussion. And then, of course, when we discuss names for God, and we don't, at least in this first section, we're primarily talking about God the Father, or God as the Godhead, that names that we're giving, rather than names for Jesus the Son. But when you take catechism, you learn, like, what is the definition of Jesus? Why do we what does Jesus mean? What does Christ mean? Those kinds of things. And so that was something that came a little bit later. And then you would memorize the various different names that Jesus had as well: Emmanuel and God with us, those kinds of things, Messiah. But yeah, I mean, this is interesting stuff, because we start with what seems like a real simple topic, biblical names for God, and we start getting into things like archetypal and ectypal knowledge and things like that. And it's amazing how it all sort of in Bavinck's discussion, it all does kind of flow together, and it makes a lot of sense. He really uses this discussion of God's name to teach us a lot about who God is and how do we know who God is. So it really was a good read.
Well, Chuck, what I find is helpful in bootstrapping this discussion is a simple concept, and I'm holding up here intentionally vague so as personal details don't come out. But I'm holding up here my checkbook and my bank book. And the interesting thing is when you think about what's involved in writing a check, there's this situation that we're in where we need to, quote unquote, settle. And in order to settle, I don't have pieces of gold or silver handy to settle my trade debt for my groceries or for the services that I buy. So what do? I pull out my checkbook and I write a check. And then in the bottom right corner of my checkbook, on that particular check, I sign my name. And that name is a symbol of authority. It's a symbol of identity. It's a symbol that it's me writing this check and not someone else. And that because of that, my bank is authorized to honor the check and pay the person out of their pile of gold and silver coins, metaphorically speaking. And so the person can take my check to the bank and it's honored because it's drawn upon my name. Now, in this case, my name is backed by the pieces of gold and silver that the bank theoretically has to honor those things, and everything checks out. And so that's a key insight, I think, for us to try to bootstrap the discussion about what the names of God are. We're going to see that throughout the treatment, we have this idea of God's personal designation. He's saying something about himself, and it involves authority. There is a general concept behind each of these names that God associates with himself. There's a progressive disclosure of these names. And then finally, there's an appropriate usage for the names. So, for example, it says, in the scriptures, do not take the name of Jehovah, your God, in vain. It's not simply about calling God Andy or Ralph or George or whatever. It's a designator that illustrates and gives us great insight. And so in that sense, there's really something special here. And we start to encounter this when we understand who God is and how he relates to us in his works. So one of the first points that comes out of this is this idea of accommodated language. Now, we could say anthropomorphic language, and Chuck, that's sometimes useful. But I typically like accommodated language because I think it's a slightly more general principle. When you hear the term accommodated language and how some people also talk about anthropomorphic language and how it relates to God's names, what are some of the things that come into your mind, and what's the reasoning behind why God would do such a thing?
Well, I'll have to admit that when I read the chapter heading and then I read through that particular section, I had to kind of go back a little bit and see what really is what Bavinck is talking about here. But I think he begins it with something that's important, right? This is God revealing himself to us, and gives us the right to name him on the basis of that self-revelation, right? So these are not names that we are creating for God. They're names that God is giving himself, and he's using to reveal himself to us. And yet, because we can't fully know God, there's a sense in which the God's name and the various names for God are there, because they're not. It's not as if there is a one perfect name for God, but they're really there to help us understand who is this God? Who is it that we worship? Who is this that is revealing himself to us using these words, this language that he himself has created? And why has he named himself in that way? These aren't just sort of names that somebody came up with. I think of names of other gods, and I often wonder where the names of some of these other small g gods came from. Zeus and Dagon and Krishna, and how do those names come? How do those names come about? And I think even those who follow those religions would often sort of and I'm no expert on other religions, but as I sort of understand it, oftentimes those names are given by human beings, and sort of signify all that there is about that God. Whereas here we're dealing with names for God that God is giving to us. And the fact that we have these multiple names for him, that is more than just about, oh, well, the Greeks called him this and the Romans called him this, but they're basically the same thing. But rather, these are various names that help us to understand who God is, and in our limitedness, to be able to see who God is, and what we need to know about him, and what God wants us to know about him. Is there anything you would want to add to that? Because I think there's a lot more to this section as well. But that sort of gets at the beginning of what Bavinck had to say.
Yeah, Chuck, that's a beautiful answer, and thank you for it. There is something special in a very real and personal sense. God's name is God himself. his being. And what we mean by this is that everything that happens that's ascribed to him rotates in this orbit, and we experience it. Now, we do not have this direct connection with what we're going to later classify or talk about as the archetype. You know, God in himself, as who he is himself, we see him connected through the orbit of things that he affects that affects us. So God is the supreme being. People love him when they love his name, and when people give thanks to and praises to his name, and they worship him. When people fear his name, they fear him naming his name. That's something that relates to the character of God. Similarly, out of this comes the name of Christ. So we talk about Christ, and very oftentimes people think that Jesus Christ is like a first name, last name designation, like John Smith. But actually, Christ is a title. So he's more accurately called Jesus the Christ. And what is this? This name of Christ, it's a name that signifies who he is. God incarnate, the God whom we believe, the God who left heaven and came and identified with us as sinners. And so everything relates to this. Now, we also mentioned that his attributes and his nature are named by this. So when we talk about God having qualities of goodness, qualities of jealousy, when we say God is powerful, or when we say God is holy, we're naming him by discussing concepts that are uniquely associated with him. Christ says this in the scriptures, I have made known your name. And he's talking about his revealing ministry, the way he lived, the way he died and rose again, the way all of these things came about, had something to say about God. We also mentioned the authorization and the checkbook idea. So there is an authority behind it. And I think one of the things that is most troubling to me, Chuck, we're always beating on modernity, and we have to properly quantify and qualify what we mean. But at the end of the day, one of the most troubling aspects to me of the secularizing forces in the Enlightenment has been the emptying of the concept of divine authority. Show me your reasoning, justify this, justify that. And at the end of the day, we're always justifying and rationalizing and coming up with reasons to explain. When God speaks, there is no further justification needed because of that divine authority. Related to that, God's name is his personal reputation, his renown. Every time we read the scriptures, every time we rehearse in our memories what God has done through history, and we esteem it and we honor it, and we say, even so, Lord, come quickly. We are revealing God's name through what he has done and who he is. So, in a real important sense, the scriptures identify God's name with his self-disclosure. And so the name depicts a verbal revelation, the way in which God makes himself known. And so we have this idea of pointing at something in identification and saying something meaningful. So when we do this, we link to, in this idea of accommodated language, we link to the God who is via the God who accommodates himself using language to speak to us. And so that's I think a very important thing to understand. And I think once that makes sense to people, the issue of is God's name Andy or Mike or Joe starts to go into the background, and we realize that we're dealing with this personal being, and we're finding out about him through the scriptures, and because of that, everything changes. So, Chuck, what were some of the highlights in your study of the names in general that made this doctrine rich and deep for you?
Yeah, one of the highlights that immediately came up is there's a quote from Augustine that starts on page 101, which is Pericope 179, and Augustine is talking about how we have these various names for God because we need more than one name for God. He says, all things can be said of God, but nothing can be said worthily of him. Nothing is more widespread than this poverty of expression. You're looking for a fitting name for him, you'll not find it. You try to speak of him in some way, you'll find that he is everything. And then to clarify why so many names can be applied to God, Augustine uses a striking illustration, Bavinck indicates. He says, our body has many needs: light and air, food and drink, shelter and clothing, and so on. And all these things are very different and exist side by side in the various parts of creation. And our spirit has many and various needs. But what provides for these needs is not multiform, but is always the one self-same divine being. And then he quotes Augustine again. On earth, a fountain is one thing, light another. When you're thirsty, you look for a fountain. And to get to the fountain, you look for light. And if there's no daylight, you light a lamp to get to the fountain. But he, meaning God, is both a fountain and a light. To the thirsty, he's a fountain. To the blind, a light. Let your eyes be open to see the light. Let the lips of your heart be open to drink of the fountain. That which you drink, you see and hear. God becomes everything to you, for he is the whole of the things you love. If you attend to visible things, well, God is neither bread, nor is he water, nor light, nor a garment, nor a house, for all these things are visible, individual, and separate. What bread is, water is not. What a garment is, a house is not. And what these things are, God is not, for they are visible things. God is all of these things to you. If you are hungry, he is bread to you. If you are thirsty, he is water to you. If you live in darkness, he is light to you, for he remains incorruptible. If you are naked, he's a garment of immortality to you, when this corruptible shall put on incorruption, and this mortal shall put on immortality. Now, there's so much to that quote, but I think as we dive into the depths of that, it really is. It really sort of gives us the complexity of who God is, and yet the simplicity also of who he is, that he is far beyond our imagination, and yet he is also exactly what we need and what we can imagine at any given moment. And I mean, in some ways that's a paradox, but it is the amazing paradox that exists because God is the creator, because he is the creator of all things, and is outside of all things. And so I just found that particular quote was one of a number of highlights in this particular chapter. How about you? Was there something here in this chapter that you especially, just as you read it really resonated to you, and you want to share it with us so it can resonate with the rest of us?
Well, that was a beautiful quote, Chuck, and I'm so moved by that insight. I do want to share something here, and I think to just take one more second, one more look at the is God's name Mike or Brett, or John issue. This actually came up in the scriptures. This was an occasion, and we can find about this in Exodus chapter 3. Now God is commissioning Moses to go and lead the people of Israel out of Egypt in an event that's going to come to be known as the Exodus. And so in Exodus chapter 3, verses 13 to 15, we have the situation, and it reads like this. Moses is receiving his commission and perhaps a bit overwhelmed, but at the same point in time, grappling with this issue of names. And here's what he says. He says and asks God, when I come to the children of Israel and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me unto you, and they shall say to me, what is his name? What shall I say unto them? And God said unto Moses, and here it comes, I am that I am. And he said, thus shall you say unto the children of Israel, I am has sent me to you. And God moreover said unto Moses, thus shall you say unto the children of Israel, Jehovah, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has sent me unto you. This is my name forever, and my memorial unto all generations. Now, what an amazing passage. And I think this sets the pattern in motion. God does not say to Moses, I am Andy. I am Jeff. He says, I am that I am. And a lot of people want to fit that name into a box. Okay, well, God is here revealing something ontologically about himself, and go into some long and deep and complicated explanation. And I don't mean to belittle that, but just mean that God is. There's something about him that is so fundamental that restricting it to any dimension, like you pointed out with the Augustine quote, is in some sense doesn't make sense. And so one of my favorite parts of the chapter is this portion. Now, I do not bring this portion up to be divisive. In our tribe, Chuck, there is a wing of Reformed theology, and a substantial wing, that will insist that God is without human emotions. And I'm happy to affirm that. And yet, to say that God does not have divine emotions, I think is a step too far. And this passage here from Bavinck was amazing. He says this, he says, every human emotion is also present in God: rejoicing, sorrow, grief, provocation, fear, love in all of its variations, such as mercy, compassion, grace, long-suffering, zeal, jealousy, repentance, hatred, wrath, vengeance. Now, this isn't just meant to be partisan with respect to our scholastic brothers, because it's not just that God has divine emotions. Bavinck continues and says this: all human actions moreover, are attributed to God. Investigating, searching minds, knowing, intending, forgetting, remembering, speaking, calling, commanding, rebuking, answering, witnessing, resting, working, seeing, hearing, smelling, testing, sitting, arising, going, coming, walking, going down, meeting, visiting, passing, abandoning, writing, sealing, engraving, striking, chastising, working, binding up, healing, killing, and making alive, wiping away, wiping out, washing, cleansing, anointing, adorning, clothing, crowning, girding, destroying, killing, inflicting, judging, condemning. Chuck, this was not about just reading a long list of things people do. This was about reading a long list of things people do and realizing that we do these things in reflection. There's something about God in his ontological being that is reflected in the language of human existence. We're going to talk more about this when we talk about the imago Dei, the image of God in the human creature. But I don't point this out to deify the creature. I point this out to say that in our interaction right now, conversing and discussing, something about God is being named, something about him is being revealed. Now, I don't say that to my credit, although I might say that to your credit, but no. The point is everything about what we do in this reality is somehow reflecting who God is. And this is going to be such a powerful image. And we're eventually going to come to the point. Now, Chuck, this is so misunderstood because sin enters into the picture and makes things very confused. But the picture is going to be made right again in the incarnation, in the divine person of Jesus, the Christ. And we're going to see in him the ultimate revelation of God himself. And so I think that this part just excited me so much about this chapter. What do you think about that transition and that sort of jumping, conceptually speaking, into thinking about, is his name Andy? Is it Ralph? Into these things of like how we get into the fundamental natures of reality itself.
Yeah, it's interesting. Speaking to that, the story of the burning bush and God giving his name as Yahweh, I am who I am, is so important because I think it tells us something very important about who he is. Right. First of all, that God is, he is a person. He's three persons. So he's personal to us. He's somebody that we can engage with. It's not like some this idea, this very pantheistic idea that God is just everything, right? God is in everything and God is everything. But rather, no, God is a person. He is an I. He exists and he is self-aware and he can speak to us. And then I am, meaning that he does exist. He is, it is not something that happened at one time before and is no longer around, but he exists. And then I am who I am. There's something really kind of neat about how that is, because on the one hand, it gives us a somewhat of the sense of the mystery that we have a hard time understanding who God is. And so the definition, I am who I am, well, yeah, what more can we say? We can't just put a name like Steve or Ibrahim or whatever. We can't put a name like that on him. He is who he is. And yet there's still something there in which it also tells us, that there's all this, there is all these other names that we now can use for him because they explain who he is. And then the interesting tie to names is, I don't know that you knew this, but my oldest son is named Jesse, and he goes by Jess now. He prefers that to Jesse, but the name Jesse simply means in Hebrew, God exists. And when we chose to name him, part of it is we liked the name, and there were people that we knew with that name that we connected with. But also in looking at meanings of names, when we saw this, that Jesse means God exists, that to us that was really important, and we wanted to name our son a name that professes what it is that we believe, that God exists. He's real. He is who he is, and he is somebody that we can relate to. And so it is really neat to be able to speak about Yahweh. I am who I am, a God who exists and who is here for all of us.
Chuck, that's so beautiful. And it touches on something very important. Now, we've been talking about God's names, Ralph, George, Fred. And I think the touchstone of your son's name being Jesse is beautiful. In a slight tangent here, I just wish to say and point out that without making it an essential characteristic of Christian devotion, there's a striking example of the secularization of our culture in the things we parents name our children. So I'm not saying that a parent is in sin to not give their children a Christian name like Jesse or John or Matthew or Mark or Luke. I'm not saying that at all. But it is so telling. People who still claim to be nominally Christian, when it comes time to naming their children, and they choose names that are completely divorced and separated from the Christian tradition, without pressing it to a breaking point, there's an evidence of where we're going as a culture in this regard. I'm not saying you can't name your child Gorthank. You're welcome to do so. And by the way, some of the biblical names are not exactly compelling to us today. Aminadab, Kedron, Zerubbabel. I'm not, there's some finger pointing and laughing to happen on both sides. But my point is that names, in some sense, reflect a beneficent idea about the person being named. And one of the beautiful things that comes out in God's names is you mentioned something earlier, Chuck, when I was talking about and referencing that Bavinck quote about all that God is. You said, and the first thing you brought up was, this is not a statement of pantheism. And I thought that was so perfect and appropriate. Here's why. God selectively partitions reality, and he donates and grants special favors to certain parts of it and not to others. So this idea that everything is God, that molecule over there, oh, that's God, that's part of God. That's a pantheistic notion. You and I are just made up of molecules, and so as such, we're a part of God. We're a part of every. No, there is a special grant that comes into the scriptures. And in a remarkable way, God conveys his name to his people and identifies them with it. When he places his name on them. They are called by his name and marked out as special. So he called Jacob by the name of Israel, which means the one who strives with God. And so Israel signifies the people of God's favor, the people who have prevailed with God. We think about some of the verses here where this donation of God's goodness in the naming of things comes out. Think of Isaiah chapter 9, verse 6. In his name shall be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Matthew chapter 1, verse 21 says this, you shall call his name Jesus. Why? For it is he that shall save his people from their sins. Numbers chapter 6, verse 27. So shall they put my name upon the children of Israel, and I will bless them. 2 Chronicles 7:14. If my people who are called by my name shall humble themselves. Now, it's not so common perhaps today, Chuck. If I am a Jacobson, or whatever, think of a typical name where we have added son to the end of it, Jacobson, Eric's son. There's this designation that there's a special. I am Brock Jacobson, let's say. Well, my name is specially donated in the identification with my father, Jacob. And that's what it meant to be Jacob's son. It wasn't just Brock Gorthank. There was this identity of love and beneficence. And so too, God has put his name on his people. Chuck, this is an amazing thing and crucial to understanding an important aspect of the scriptures, which is this: the particular nature of God's people. Chuck, it's a common thing in modern secularized time to say the brotherhood of man. And if it's said properly, I agree with it. There is a brotherhood of man in some sense. But when it comes to God's special people, a special identity, that is an additional donation of God's name on a special and elect, a chosen people. Now, Chuck, I don't mean to say by this, I'm elect and you are not. Ha, 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 ha. I am special. What I mean to say by this is we need to fear God because he puts his name on some and not all in salvation. And that's a fearsome thing. That's a fearsome aspect of his holy name. And I mean fearsome, not in the sense that God's doing something wrong, but I mean fearsome in the sense that modern universalistic ideas, God owes everyone salvation, those ideas are so far fundamentally off of the designations that God only applies to a special people that we have to say it. We have to make this point, even though it's an uncomfortable point to be made. And so, Chuck, when you think about that, this particularizing aspect of God's gracious donation of his names to his people and not people universally, what does that inspire in you, and where does that lead you when you're thinking about this?
Well, first of all, it's a reminder of the relationship that we have with God, right? That it is a relationship of grace, of favor, that God has given to us. He is all things. He is the creator of all things. And he can do as he wills, and yet he chooses to have grace on us, to give us this ability to understand him through these names that he reveals to us, that tell us about who he is. And so there is something of grace simply in the idea that God has names that we can apply to him, right? He's not merely some nameless force that we can have no connection with, even though he is much bigger and much greater than any name we could ever put on him. In many ways, the names that we use for him are in some ways limiting, and yet he gracefully allows us to use these names and to understand these names as a way of understanding who he is. It's a way that he condescends to us through that. So I think that's an important thing to remember about that. And then, of course, what is our natural response? Our natural response ought to be to praise that name, to praise the name of God. I think of in the Roman Catholic tradition, there is, I know, there's the Holy Name Society. In my town, the large Catholic church on the north side is called Holy Name Church. It's a big, beautiful church dedicated to the holy name of God. And while we may disagree with some of the ways that Roman Catholics talk about some of the theology around the name of God, I think one thing that we do very much have in common with Roman Catholics is this idea that the holy name of God is something that not only do we revere, not only do we prize so highly that we don't take that name in vain, but rather lift it up and praise it. But then we also see it as a gift that is to be responded to. So I love the fact that in my town, when you go by Holy Name Church, it's this old, it's 150 plus years old. It's this beautiful old style church with this beautiful old style architecture that absolutely points to the grandeur of God, points you upwards in a way to think of this name that is above all names, and yet is also concrete and set here, on a city block here in the city. And the bells of that church can be heard all over the city, because it's still something that's concrete that we can grab a hold of as we can with the name of God. And so I just kind of love the fact that the largest church, in many ways, it probably isn't the largest church anymore, because you have these newer churches that kind of get spread out, but this beautiful cathedral is Holy Name Church, named and dedicated to the holy name of God. So yeah, that's it's a wonderful thing to think about.
There's a philosophical take here that relates to the idea of names. And Chuck, this can be deep. This can go long. We're long out in the middle of the ocean. We're away from the shores of, is God's name Ralph or Chaz? Chuck, what would you do if God's name turned out to be Chaz? I don't know. I just think something would be horribly wrong there. No offense to our dear friends named Chaz. One place where this really shows is in the areas of philosophical contemplation and conception. In thinking about God's names, in thinking about his designations, in thinking about how he moves and acts and causes things to move and act in the reality he's created, in thinking about all of these things, we're in fact doing theology. We're in fact performing the task of examining God's names. Now, there's a challenge, Chuck, outside of Christianity. And that is it even legitimate to speak about a being who coincides with reality in such a unique respect? And this can be made more concrete by someone asking, how can God exist if I can't see him? Point to him, give him a name. And Chuck, it's a legitimate question. But here's the issue. Bavinck talks about it and says this: even the most advanced speculation and the most searching philosophy still has to think and speak about God. Though we throw out all concrete representations and retain only pure and abstract concepts, they will never transcend the necessity of thinking and speaking in human, creaturely terms, or come closer to the Infinite One himself. Now, philosophy is tried, and Bavinck's going to point this out. Even the most abstract names, existence, substance, the absolute, the one, the spirit, reason, they are and they remain anthropomorphisms. As humans, we have only two alternatives: either absolute silence or human thought and speech about God. Either agnosticism, that is to say, a theoretical atheism, or anthropomorphism. Philosophy, accordingly, has always again returned to anthropomorphism. If it had not, it would, of course, also have ended up with a negative criticism. Now, Chuck, these are deep waters, but basically, someone comes up to you on the street, grabs you by the lapel, lifts you up. How dare you speak about God? How can you even name him? How can you even talk about him? And I'm hanging here, and this guy's lifted me up. I can say to him, I speak about this God because he has revealed himself. And so in such a situation, the absolute necessity of divine revelation as a precondition for any consideration, any theological consideration, is important. Our atheist friends are right in an abstract sense, not about their atheism, but about how could you, little human creature that you are, how could you have knowledge about this God at all? And the answer must be that being, that creature, must condescend, must accommodate, must reach down to where we are. Now, he has done that. Acts chapter 3, verse 16 says this: through faith in the name of Jesus, this man was healed. Acts 3, chapter 6 says this: but Peter said, silver or gold I do not have, but what I have I give you. In the name of Jesus Christ of Nazareth, get up and walk. Acts chapter 4, verse 10. Let this be known to all of you and to all the people of Israel. It is by the name of Jesus Christ of Nazareth, whom you crucified, but whom God raised from the dead. that this man stands before you healed. Theology is completely underpinned by the gracious donation of God in his names. This means, to make the long story short, this means, Chuck, that all attempts to deconstruct Christianity and reconstruct Christianity around some revelationless, presuppositionless school of philosophical thought are a categorical error. Someone says, I do not wish to find God in the Holy Scriptures. I wish to deconstruct, using the scientific method, the reality of history, and reconstruct from community conscious, from science, from secularly progressive ideas, wish to reconstitute Christianity. The Bible was nice when we read it, when we were young, and it gave us warm fuzzies. But now we're older, we're mature, we think better than that. Chuck, such an inquiry is not going to succeed. The Christian faith doesn't just, not simply the traditional Christian faith, but any faith in the true God is going to rise and fall based on the quality of its inquiry around God's self-disclosure. Now, Chuck, I hate saying all of that philosophical verbiage when it's so much simpler to just say Christianity rises and falls with the accuracy of the Holy Scriptures in what they testify to. And so in that sense, the Scriptures are not God's name. God's name is not Holy Bible. And yet we read those Scriptures, and through them we are studying the names of God. We are understanding who God is in a way that would not be possible in any other way, given that the revelation of the Scriptures is true. Where does that take things in your mind?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that I want to sort of, the direction that I want to take it, sort of saying the same thing that you're saying, but in a slightly different direction. The fact that we don't have the ability to fully speak of God, the fact that in many ways he is so far beyond us that he's invisible, doesn't mean that the words that we speak about him, they may be inadequate, but that doesn't make them untrue. There is still truth in these words that we use. Bavinck talks about how our knowledge is in every respect finite and limited, but not for that reason impure or untrue. Fully adequate or exhaustive knowledge is something of which we possess very little, and yet we can still know the truth. He makes the point here. It's on page 106, and I just lost where I want to begin this. But he says, all our talk of invisible things, so things like God that are just beyond us, all of our talk of invisible things is metaphorical, it's figurative, it's poetic. For the things that are known are beyond all naming, for the principal name of things known and immaterial is nothing. That's a quote from Gregory of Nazianzus. But this does not mean that when we say that what we say is untrue and incorrect, the fact that God is beyond all naming, the fact that our knowledge of him is in many ways metaphorical and figurative and poetic, doesn't mean that there's not truth there. In fact, he says, on the contrary, real poetry is truth. I loved that line. As an English major, it made my heart sing. Real poetry is truth, for it is based on the resemblance, similarity, and kinship that exist between different groups of phenomena. All language, all metaphors and similes, all symbolism are based on and presuppose this penetration of the visible by the invisible world. So we have this invisible world that we, as limited humans, cannot really even comprehend, and yet God gives us the ability to still understand the truth. He penetrates our visible world with the invisible world and gives us his names, these metaphors, these symbols, these similes, this language that still gives us truth. And Bavinck finally puts it this way: he says, if speaking figuratively were untrue, all of our thought and knowledge would be an illusion, and speech itself impossible, right? Because that's really what speech is. It is in many ways a symbol of the actual ideas that are there. That's why we have different languages, and we may use different even names for God. The word God in English, or Gott in German, or Dios in Spanish. They're different words. They symbolize something, and yet there is truth in them. And so I really, this was another section of this chapter that just really spoke to me, and it sang to me in stanzas of poetry. It's not often that you can talk about theology in terms of it being poetic, and I love that we could do that here.